We haven't met before. I'm Lee, a normal enough guy living a normal enough life in a middle class suburb of Australia. So, nothing to see here. Except that one day, a dozen years ago, my life collapsed. I've been earning a solid consulting wage in the IT industry for many years, which bought me a nice home in a priced suburb and a huge mortgage. I had the freedom to holiday every so often and to occasionally do what really turned me on, which was racing one of these. It wasn't the job of my dreams, and not the life I'd imagined as a kid, but I guess I was doing okay. I didn't know it at the time, but there'd been a bomb ticking in my head that one day detonated. The work I once did was very stressing and quite highly paid, that later in life I learned I wasn't suited to emotionally. I didn't have the temperament needed to survive that industry for long periods, but year after year I pushed myself back into it, ignoring the voice in my head and the pleas from family and friends who could see that life was hurting me. I kept going back because that's what I did for a living. I was a contractor hired by the project, and every project I did left a residue of stress that accumulated and one day went critical. On that day, my cognitive function shut down, my peripheral vision receded to a tunnel, and my perception of colour vanished. On that day, I had to tell my boss I could no longer do it. After months of trying to hide the symptoms from her, there was nowhere left to hide, and I had to fess up. I went home that day and began a descent into a zombie state that's dogged me ever since. Or black dogged me, if you'll permit the pun. This was a depression that closed over me like a shroud, and while my physical vital signs were strong, my mind was mummified by the wet cement in my skull. My short-term memory was so impaired I couldn't make conversation because by the time I'd spoken the end of a sentence, I'd forgotten the beginning. I was so racked with physical pain I could barely move, while at the same time I was almost completely numb. This was a confusing and frightening time. I spent the next 6 months in bed, hauling myself up at midday and walking once around the block if I could manage it, before collapsing again and sleeping on and off until the following day. And that was my life for 6 months. 6 months of near total incapacitation, during which my only human contact was the family and friends who called by occasionally because they were worried. During this period, mine was a life of acute anxiety and mounting debt. I was completely screwed. One morning, after 6 months of this hibernation, I woke up to a loud buzzing in my brain and a bewildering attack of colour, and a field of vision that seemed to surround me through 360 degrees. The previous night, my brain had switched back on. After 6 months of dormancy, my higher brain functions without warning came back online. After 6 months of seeing the world through a tunnel, my peripheral vision returned. After 6 months of 8-bit black and white, the world was suddenly a freakish kaleidoscope of colour. And after 6 months of hearing the world through cotton wool, I woke to a disorienting cacophony of noise. It was sudden, confusing, and traumatic. In that time, my brain had shut out reality as best it could, because it needed to take a break. And in that time, my internal world had resized. In the period of adjustment that followed, I realised something for the first time, that the human brain is the same as any muscle in the body. When you work it, it gets stronger, and when you continue working it, it gets tired, and then starts to weaken and slow down before it shuts down to protect itself. Which led me to another epiphany. In Australia, we spend a minimum of 11 years in institutions of formal education. And that's 11 years in which our brain learns to be always on. 11 years without ever knowing how to switch off and recover. So, how would you go working 11 years with not a day off? And that's exactly what most of us do, thanks to the expectations of society. Many of us learn the state of always on without ever learning how to throttle back and recover. And that was the bomb ticking inside my skull. The same bomb that ticks within the skulls of millions like me. And it gets much worse. When we get to college, that 11 years of always on becomes 17. And then we graduate and take our tired minds into the crazy world of work, where many of us gradually devolve into shell-shocked automatons of the workplace, using rush hour to switch off for the first time today. And that was my professional life. The special joy of rush hour, bookending a 9-hour day spent sitting down in artificial air and artificial light, doing artificial work, which every day crippled my soul minutely more. And millions of people live the same way. 5 days a week, every week, for an adult lifetime. Even if you're one of the lucky ones who has a job you love, you're still under siege from a world that keeps getting crazier. The relentless assault of advertising, the harassment of constant noise and light pollution, the burden of simply keeping a modern life working with all its moving parts, and on top of the treadmill of unrelenting competition and one-upmanship. The need to look better, the need to be smarter, the need for more money and more status, on and on without respite. How surprising is it really that many of us can no longer cope? This was me a few years ago. Looking somewhat weathered, but mostly recovered since that brain shut down a decade earlier. Shortly before having another crisis, whose impacts I live with today. In 2012, the dominoes began falling once again, and this time I was fired after doing some good work for a company whose culture was the most unpleasant I'd encountered. And as it turned out, my industry had quietly entered a downturn while I was in that place, and when I was suddenly out of there, my phone had stopped ringing. This was the beginning of systemic unemployment, which ushered in a period of chronic and acute financial stress, which forced some painful lifestyle changes. After more than a year of searching, hope came in the form of a high-paying job, coincidentally around the corner from where I lived with my girlfriend. And this was heaven sent, a real shot at shoring up my broken life and damaged spirit until I got fired again. And this time it was really ugly. It was early December, so no one was hiring for the next 2 months. And with my spirits down, my energy depleted, and way too much time to hang around the house, another relationship failed. And because I was living with this girl under her roof, I suddenly had no relationship, no home, no job, and somehow no career. But as bad as all that was, the worst thing by far was that my confidence was gone. My self-belief had vaporized, and I was in a world of pain. Several years on, I still can't explain why or how an entire industry turned its back on me. But it did, and all I had left was a pile of IT experience I could no longer use, and a whole lot of time to think about how my life had turned out. At 44, I was starting again. I thought back on all of it, and began remembering all of the people I'd met and heard about, who'd had a struggle in some way similar to mine. And an idea began rustling in my brain. Any experience as powerful and damaging as this had been to me has within it learning and wisdom that cannot be bought. But I'm just one of millions who've been through this, or much worse. I wondered what would happen if my wisdom and experience was added to everybody else's wisdom and experience in the same place. I realised we'd accumulate a body of knowledge that's valuable beyond measure, and so began the Depression Demystified project. I wanted this to be a private membership community that was exclusive and affordable, that people could join for $9 a month. If I could attract enough members at that price, I could hire a researcher and a writer to help me serve up the latest science while members made contributions of their own. Soon we'd have enough data of our own to feed into the research community. It was an area in which I had no following and no expertise, but some very raw experience. The idea was simple. Let's empower people to heal themselves by helping others heal, simply by sharing their stories. I wanted those sufferers to never again feel cold-shouldered by society, by a medical industry that has no answers, by governments that didn't care, and by loved ones who may or may not understand. I thought of all those people trying desperately to hide their affliction from their boss, and inciting every emotion in people from worry and frustration to skepticism and even suspicion. We all know that feeling of being the special case that others can't understand, which includes a medical system whose solution is to classify you somehow and then throw drugs at the problem, which is the profession's way of saying, we don't know. But here's what I began to realise, that I'm part of an epidemic, that the world is only now waking up to. If you relate to anything I'm saying here, it'll be because you're part of the epidemic too. Recently I saw some statements made by physicians who work with people like you and I, and what they wrote shocked me to the core. Dr. Nancy Klimas in 2009 said, "I split my clinical time between the two illnesses HIV and CFS, and I can tell you, if I had to choose between the two, I'd rather have HIV." And this, by Dr. Daniel Pedersen. "In my experience, ME or CFS, same thing, is one of the most disabling diseases that I care for, far exceeding HIV except for the terminal stages. Depression, more disabling than HIV. What? I know how bad CFS is because it shaped my life for a long time, but I've never had HIV. But here's a physician who knows both HIV and CFS saying that CFS is, in some ways, maybe worse than HIV. For the first time, I had context for what I was living with. And that epidemic I mentioned, there's millions of us living with an affliction that may or may not be more disabling than HIV. I could not believe what I was reading. But there was more. Dr. William Reeves in 2006, "We've documented, as have others, that the level of functional impairment in people who suffer from CFS is comparable to multiple sclerosis, AIDS, end-stage renal failure, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease." Dr. Nancy Klimas again in 2006. "They, ME or CFS patients, experience a level of disability equal to that of patients with late-stage AIDS and patients undergoing chemotherapy." Professor Mark Lovelace, 1995. "ME or CFS patients feel effectively the same every day as an AIDS patient feels 2 months before death." And Dr. Jose Montoya in 2011. "My dream is that our medical community will produce a formal apology to the patients that, not having believed them all these years, they are facing a real illness." Does this get your attention? It got mine. As I said, I know what it's like to live with CFS, but I'd never known or even thought about HIV until I read this stuff. I found these comparisons shocking. As I write this, I'm listening to an Australian expert discussing youth suicide. His words, "We are trashing entire generations of young people." I'm fortunate to live in Australia. Many people call it the lucky country. Here in the lucky country, the biggest killer of people between 18 and 30 is suicide. Not car wrecks, not booze, drugs or street violence. Suicide. Kids killing themselves in the lucky country. How is that possible? The only solace in that tragic fact is that you and I are not alone. But ultimately, that's not very comforting, and something else is needed. I'd like you to join me in trying to unravel this mysterious, crippling, and cruel phenomenon by becoming a member of the Depression Demystified support community and then sharing your story, as others like us are sharing theirs. I've given you mine, and now I'd like to hear yours, because it matters. Your story matters, and others need to hear it. So I'm inviting you to share it in a safe place of people with stories of their own. Because while science tries to figure it out, people are suffering and finding their own ways to get by. The stories of what you and I are doing to cope matter, and these stories need a home. And what we discover here can, maybe, support the science. So, let's get this discussion going. Join the Depression Demystified support community for $9 a month and tell us how you live with it. We can all benefit, whether you live with CFS like me, or anxiety or bipolar, or all of them, or something completely different. Each of us is in this thing, and we're stronger and smarter together than alone. So join us. We look forward to meeting you.